All right, thanks for coming to my GDC talk. Let's get started. My name is Gabby DaRienzo. I'm a Toronto-based independent game developer who's been working as a game artist and art director in the industry for about 8 years. Here are some of the projects I'm known for. I think it's this side. I very recently started working with Drinkbox Studios, who are the creators of Guacamelee and Severed. And whenever I start working with a new team, I like to take a moment to reflect on my past work and think about my strengths as an artist as well as some skills that I can improve on. So lately, I've been thinking a lot about my recent experience with creative block, and that's what I want to talk about today. So let's go back to a couple of years, 2017, which was a very eventful year for me. Early in 2017, I worked as an art director on a game called Graceful Explosion Machine, which was a very colorful shoot 'em up and was also one of the first games that launched on the Nintendo Switch. So, needless to say, it did extremely well. We were very happy with that launch, and the creator of Graceful Explosion Machine, Mobeen Fikri, asked me to art direct his next project, which we would start working on later that year. Later in 2017, I also released a game with my own studio called Laundry Bear Games called Morticians Tale, which was a very emotional, story-driven game where you play as a mortician running a funeral home. And Morticians Tale launched to massive critical praise. It was nominated for a bunch of awards and stuff, and we were so happy with that launch that we decided to start prototyping a new game. So around the end of 2017, while we're in the middle of launching A Mortician's Tale, I started working as an art director on what would eventually become Super Crush KO, as well as art directing Laundry Bear's next project. I was juggling a lot of creative and art direction projects at the same time, and you can probably see where this is going. Around the end of that year and the beginning of 2018, I started feeling really exhausted all the time. I felt really foggy and I had a hard time focusing on things. I was struggling to work a full 8-hour day. I also started feeling really unmotivated. Even though I was really excited about the projects I was working on, it felt like a struggle for me to actually sit down and do the work. And when I did do the work on them, I wasn't happy with the work I was producing. I felt frustrated with myself, and I felt like I was making a lot of bad decisions. And on top of that, and this is something that I'm particularly embarrassed about, I was also becoming a very argumentative person with my teammates. They would give me feedback or would share ideas with me, and I would get really defensive about my own art. I was miserable, and I imagine I wasn't a very pleasant person to work with at the time. And all these feelings started bleeding into my personal life as well. I'm a pretty creative person, and I enjoy making things outside of my work, but suddenly I started feeling less motivated to work on even personal creative projects. Normally after work, I would come home and would spend my evenings with hobbies like drawing for fun or baking or gardening or whatever. But suddenly I didn't feel motivated to do even those things anymore. I spent a lot of my free time just at home watching Netflix or scrolling aimlessly through social media. And as a creative person, not doing creative things made me feel worse. And after several months of dealing with all these awful feelings, both at work and at home, my partner suggested that I might be burnt out and maybe dealing with creative block. So, what is creative block and where does it come from? Well, creative block is described as the inability to access your internal creativity, which can result in the inability to create, the lack of motivation to create, and overall just mental and emotional fatigue. It primarily affects people who are in creative positions. So in our industry, it would be, artists, writers, musicians and sound designers, game designers, etc. And there's a lot of reasons why this might happen to a person. Sorry, I'm trying to lean away from the mic so you don't get that good tea ASMR. Okay, one theory as to why creative block happens is because our ability to discern something good has surpassed our ability to make something good. This is a handy chart that I've seen pop up on the internet over the last few years. And while this is mostly used to talk about art block, I think it also applies to other creative positions as well. This chart shows that a creator's progression in skill over their lifetime, with the red line representing the creator's ability to make something good, and the blue line representing the creator's ability to discern something that is good. When our ability to make something good surpasses our ability to discern something good, this is called a creative high. But when our ability to discern something good surpasses our ability to make something good, this is called a creative low or creative block. And this is absolutely a thing I've dealt with over my career, in my personal life and in my professional life. And I admit it feels pretty lousy when it happens. But another reason why creative block happens is because of external pressure, feeling like everyone is watching you and that you're letting people down if you aren't productive or good enough. And in this day and age of indie games, especially with so many games being released constantly, it's important that your game stands out, that it is beautiful and unique and runs well on every platform it needs to run well on, and that the whole game is simple enough to be made by a smaller team on top of that. And if you're an indie developer watching this, you probably understand this pressure to be successful because you and your team's personal finances and well-being depend on it. And if you're not an indie developer, if you work in AAA or you're just an aspiring dev, this pressure might sound silly, but it's absolutely real. And it absolutely adds stress onto game artists, musicians, writers, and designers especially. You feel like you can't just make art, you have to make beautiful, one of a kind while also being efficiently made art. And that pressure can sometimes prevent you from making any art at all. When I had first started art directing Graceful Explosion Machine and A Morticians Tale years ago, I didn't feel any pressure at all, really. I was a relatively unknown game developer and artist, and I didn't feel like there were any existing expectations of me. However, I was still a person suffering from anxiety, and I often dreamed about making successful games. But once I finally achieved that success, my anxiety didn't go away. In fact, that success only made it worse. Both Graceful Explosion Machine and Mortician's Tale were successful, and I suddenly felt pressure to replicate the success, not just for one game, but for two new games. And to be perfectly clear, my colleagues weren't the ones putting this pressure onto me. I was doing it to myself. And in hindsight, this wasn't very fair of me to do so because ultimately, success is not a cure for mental illness. I think as much as we've grown as a society and we're a lot more open and understanding of things like depression and anxiety, we still have a tendency to take them a lot less seriously than other types of illnesses. But at the time of my burnout, I remember feeling really angry with myself for still being anxious and depressed and creatively blocked despite having some success. But taking the time to take a step back and acknowledge my creative block and point to this external pressure I was feeling as the cause of it helped me start to find solutions as to how to overcome it. When we started working on Super Crush KO, I was given the opportunity by Mo to not only do art direction, but to also take some creative direction over the game as well, with things like story and themes and narrative. But because I was dealing with this creative block, largely caused by this external pressure I just described, I started making some really silly decisions. The art wasn't bad necessarily, but it was boring. It's something that we had seen several times before. The story was safe and uninteresting, and the character designs were uninspired. And when I showed this to my teammates and other colleagues in the industry, the reactions were all very lukewarm, which is not really the reaction you want when you're trying to make something cool and unique. I remember feeling really frustrated with myself for not immediately having a brilliant idea for the art and story for this new game. And in hindsight, I wasn't being very fair to myself. When you start out with doing pre-production, concepting and developing art for a game, you don't, or at least very rarely, you don't immediately come up with the finalized look to your game. This process takes time and iteration. More likely, when you start concepting a game, you start out with this kind of stuff. Mood boards, images that inspire you, rough sketches and ideas, color swatches and palettes. You start with the basics. And because I was so stressed about getting it right the first time, I forgot completely how much fun concepting can be. When I started working at Drinkbox Studios a few months ago, I told our concept lead, Kusho Kihano, about my struggles with this, and he said something to me that I will never forget, which is, you can't get too precious about concept art. The whole point of concept art, whether it's, the whole point of concepting in general, whether it's art, writing, or music, is that you're coming up with as many ideas as possible and seeing what sticks. And concepting is supposed to be a fun, messy part of game development, and it's supposed to be enjoyable. It's the only time in the game development cycle, really, that you can just set your limits aside and come up with as many ideas as you possibly can. Sometimes you come up with bad ideas, but you also come up with good stuff too. And while I was working on Super Crush, I was so stressed about coming up with something unique and getting everything right the first time that I completely forgot about how much fun and concept art is and how much fun it is to just trust myself with my own art. When I was studying graphic design in school, I had a professor who used to repeat this phrase to me, which was, don't try to be different, just try to be good. The idea behind this phrase is that by focusing firstly on being good, following the basics of design, making decisions that you know work, and trusting your own instincts of what is good, you will ultimately make something that is different. Good is different enough. And if this doesn't make any sense to you, I totally understand this is a bit of a weird concept and phrase. So here's an example that will hopefully help illustrate this better. If you haven't played this already, this is Hold Down, a mobile game by Martin Johannesson that came out a few years ago for iOS and Android. And while the artwork isn't necessarily anything new, we've seen lots of minimal, flat-shaded 2D games before. What makes Hold Down so special is how well it's executed. Its animations are bouncy, and it uses particles, screen shake, visual effects, and feedback to make the game feel really satisfying. And it has this weird little worm thing that doesn't really do anything, but it acts as a super cute and super recognizable mascot for the game. Martin took great care in designing Hold Down to feel good, first and foremost, and that allowed it to be different and to stand out, and for it to become as popular and successful as it has been. When I think back to when I started to do concept artwork for Super Crush KO, I was focusing so hard on being different that I totally forgot about being good first. So around the beginning of 2018, Mo saw that I was experiencing this creative block and told me to take a month off just to figure it out. And having this time allowed me to take a step back from my frustrations, refocus, and ultimately start to make good decisions for the art of the game. This month away from my usual work was really important, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to have that much needed break. And this is where my biggest piece of advice comes in. If you're experiencing art block, do not isolate yourself from others. You do not have to suffer this alone. If you're working with a team or have colleagues, tell them about your struggles with creative block or burnout, and encourage them to do the same with you. Sometimes people can give you an outside opinion or advice you may not have considered if you were just working alone. And having a group of colleagues you can trust allows you to inspire, uplift, and support each other during creative block or other frustrating times like this. I'm very fortunate to live in a city that has a big indie games community, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the industry I can turn to, but I realize this might not be the case for everybody, especially if you live somewhere that doesn't have a community, or maybe you're new to the industry or whatever. And if this is the case for you, I recommend trying to look online. Forums, Discords, social media can be a great place to make friends and learn from other game developers and find your community. Having people to turn to when you're experiencing creative block, including online friends, can be beneficial for yourself and for them too. The internet, of course, can be a great resource for tutorials and to find inspiration, which leads me to my next piece of advice for overcoming art block, which is surround yourself with inspiration. If you're feeling uninspired and frustrated with the things that you're making, try surrounding yourself with other art, music, or writing that you like, that motivates you and that makes you feel good. And if you're looking to come up with something unique for your game, try your best to look outside of what people are already doing in video games. When I took my break with Super Crush KO, I started a new morning habit where every day, or before I started my work for the day, I would drink a cup of tea and spend 10 minutes scrolling through various art and design websites. Not only was this a great way for me to encourage myself to feel motivated before starting my day, but I was also being inspired by things outside of video games. Things like architecture and film, fashion, photography, makeup, drag, graphic design, industrial design, TV shows, anime, music, toys, and nature, just to name a few. In May of 2018, our team started working out of a physical office in Toronto, and for the first time since I started making indie games, I had access to permanent wall space that I could use for putting up artboards. I printed out inspiration for Super Crush KO, as well as some early sketches and concepts, and this became a great way to surround myself with the art that was inspiring me, as well as my own art that I was making. Having physical reminders in front of you for both these things is really motivating, and also allows you to receive feedback and ideas from office mates, which happened quite frequently, and was also very helpful. So after my month-long break, where I spent time surrounding myself with inspiration and letting myself have fun with the concept art, I came back to the Super Crush KO team with this mock-up. And the reaction was a complete 180 from the reactions I was getting the first time when I showed them my old bad art. People were excited and talked about it happily. Their faces lit up. This was the exact reaction I wanted, and it was so validating and motivating. This single mock-up was able to inform the art for the rest of the game, which we continue to iterate on and make better, as well as some other decisions for the rest of the game when it came to narrative, music, and even gameplay. This also allowed me to feel a lot more confident with my decisions and helped direct the other artists working with me on the team when it came to animation and cutscene art. We as a team were able to make the game a lot more cohesive once we had this art direction, and this is ultimately where the title of Super Crush KO came from. Crushing your robot enemies and maybe also developing a bit of a crush on the antagonist while you're at it. So, in short, I was able to overcome this massive year-long creative block by acknowledging my burnout and understanding the external pressure causing it, taking a little break from the work that was frustrating me and finding the fun in concept art again, leaning on my team for support, focusing on making something good first before making something different, and surrounding myself with non-game inspiration daily. I'm also glad to say that by overcoming my creative block on Super Crush, I was able to overcome my art creative block on the other project I was working with Laundry Bear. It also provided me with a list of tangible exercises I can do if I ever find myself going through creative block again, whether it's with Drinkbox or on a personal project, whatever. So now here is a short list of exercises I did that worked for me and will hopefully work for you if you ever find yourself experiencing creative block. Number 1 is revisit your basics. If you've been making art or music or writing or been designing games for a while, chances are you feel pretty confident with your fundamentals. However, if I'm feeling stuck, I find revisiting these basics to be very helpful. For art, it could be things like color theory, anatomy, lighting. Even if you're already quite familiar with these things, sometimes finding a tutorial and revisiting your fundamentals can open up new doors you may have forgotten about or never considered before. Number 2 is try a new thing. If you're feeling stuck with your current work, try playing with a new medium. For art, if you're primarily working digitally, try sketching things out with pen or marker. If you're a writer who primarily uses one digital tool, try switching to a different tool or using pen and paper. If you're a musician who largely works with synths, try picking up an acoustic instrument. Acoustic? Or vice versa. This also goes for subject matter. Sometimes by creating something in a genre or mood we don't normally work with can be creatively stimulating. If you're an artist who mostly draws figures and people, try drawing environments instead. If you're a game designer who largely designs action or fighting games, try your hand at paper prototyping a puzzle game or a visual novel. If you're a musician who largely writes happy, whimsical songs, try writing something darker and more serious. If you are creative professionally and you find your hobbies fall into the same category as what you do for a living, try a different hobby that's completely unrelated, like drawing or picking up a new sport or baking or writing or knitting or gardening or reading or carpentry or playing a musical instrument, whatever. By taking the time to try new things, whether it's a medium, subject matter, or hobby, you're allowing yourself to be creative in new ways you've never experienced before, and sometimes this can inspire all new ideas and motivations for you. My third tip is to do something creative for yourself every day. This one might seem pretty obvious, but it's important to differentiate personal creative projects from professional creative projects. If I say draw every day, I don't mean draw every day so you can be productive or draw every day so you can practice and eventually be better. And while these are both important, I recommend drawing every day or finding something creative to do every day purely for yourself. Not for something work-related, not for professional development, not to put on the internet. Do something creative every day for you. You don't have to overthink it. You don't have to spend longer than 30 seconds. That's all the time you have for it. But just take the time to make something for you. And the reason why I recommend this is because if you're a person like me who makes art professionally, sometimes it's easier to forget that making art can also just be for fun and personal enjoyment. So this daily drawing or creative exercise is entirely for you. And if you're the kind of person who likes to be productive constantly, and the idea of not being productive is stressful for you, then allow me to explain this exercise in a way that might resonate with you better. Taking time off is productive. I like this quote from one of my favorite artists, Heikala. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry. That says, "I try to keep a habit of sketching every day as I believe your imagination is like a muscle that you need to exercise frequently." And I absolutely agree with them. As much as drawing every day is for yourself, it's also in a subconscious way for your work and your productivity as well. And this leads me to my final tip for overcoming creative block or burnout, which is be kind to yourself. If you're feeling frustrated and angry with yourself over experiencing creative block the way that I felt, continuing to be angry is not going to help you. It's okay to take a break or take time off to do something unrelated and be forgiving to yourself. And I realize this probably sounds really wishy-washy, especially in comparison to all the tangible advice that I just listed, but it's just as necessary and important to remember. Being kind to yourself is a simple and small thing you can do to yourself that ultimately makes a big positive change for you and your mental health. So, Super Crush KO was released in January of this year, and I'm really proud of it. I'm really proud of this super colorful, super gay thing that we made that people seem to really like. This is some cool fan art that someone made. It's really cool. I'm very excited about this. And I'm really proud of my team, and I'm really proud of myself too, for overcoming this really rough creative block and to be able to have a list of tools that I can share with you and other people who might be experiencing creative block or who might know someone who is or may experience creative block in the future. So, in closing, if you're experiencing creative block, you are not a bad artist. If you're experiencing creative block, you are not a bad game designer. If you're experiencing creative block, you are not alone. If I can overcome it, so can you. That was really cheesy, but thank you for listening to my talk regardless. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions about creative block or Super Crush or making art for games, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm at GabDar on Twitter. Thank you so much again.